Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, 10 Principles for Better Dashboard Design, brought to you by Logi Analytics. I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Mana Habibian. Mana is the product designer at Venngage. She works on the UX of the tool by creating lo-fi and lo-fi to hi-fi UX prototypes to articulate the desired product experience. She validates ideas by speaking with Venngage customers and collaborates with other product owners, QA, and engineers in an agile environment. She previously studied behavioral neuroscience and microbiology at the University of British Columbia, where she researched how people's experiences are shaped. In her current role, she is able to apply behavioral research in a different way to understand users and improve the tool to meet their needs.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. As mentioned, my name is Mana, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the 10 principles of better dashboard design. So I'm a product designer at a company called Venngage, where we offer an online graphic design tool that is built for people with no design experience who want to communicate better visually. So let's begin. What is a dashboard? So at its simplest, a dashboard is a screen in your application that displays information. Normally, a dashboard provides the user a global overview with access to the most important data, functions, and controls. We call them dashboards because just like in a car, they're meant to show us critical pertinent data at a glance. Think about how it's done in a car. So the car's dashboard is used to show the driver information relevant to the task of driving the car. Speed, distance covered, engine revs, remaining fuel, and warnings when something isn't working properly. We don't expect a car's dashboard to display information about the news, local places of interest, or anything, however interesting it may be, because it is not relevant. So how do we establish what's relevant enough to show in a dashboard? So that takes me to my first principle, which is to know your audience. The user is always the most important, and you must have an intimate knowledge of them to design for them. So deciding the relevant information to display in your dashboard can be tricky. So you need to start by developing user personas and mapping out user stories so you can understand the expectations that users have in your application. For most application dashboards, users will expect to see information about their current status, as well as any urgent information, warnings, or alerts that they need to deal with. So diving into user personas, a persona is a representation of a significant portion of your users, and it can sometimes incorporate thousands of individuals. Personas are also used as a way to understand and design for the mindset of people who will use your product and services. So why do we need them? As I mentioned, they're a reminder of our users, as personas are made up of real people, and they personify a user's narrative. So they tell us about user skills, attitudes, environments, jobs to be done, pain points. Do they have any frustrations that we need to address? What do they already know about? It helps focus our design, it helps with our design decisions, and it helps with planning the dashboard. So moving on to creating relevant personas, you need to conduct user research that incorporates user interviews, creating affinity diagrams, empathy maps. So going a little bit into user interviews, it is a UX, so user experience research method, during which a researcher will ask users questions about a certain topic, just to understand their way of thinking, what, as I mentioned before, what their pain points are, what their frustrations are, what they expect to see. So you want to run user interviews before you have a design to even start with, just to get that initial information. You also want to run it at the end of a usability test. But keep in mind that when you're doing a user interview at the end of a usability test, you want to make sure that you are not priming the user to pay special attention to whatever feature or issues you're asking about. The next thing I mentioned was doing affinity diagramming. So affinity diagramming is a method which can help you gather large amounts of data and organize them into groupings based on themes or relationships. So when you conduct a bunch of user interviews, you can usually put insights onto sticky notes and put them on a wall and try to organize these into themes and relationships so that you can have a better idea of who your user persona is going to be. And empathy maps are basically split into 4 quadrants. So what the user says, what the user thinks, what the user does, and what the user feels, with the user or persona in the middle. So empathy maps provide a glance into what who the user is as a whole, and it externalizes knowledge about users in order to create a shared understanding of what our user needs and helps us in decision making. So once you do that, that can help you prioritize your insights. You can also add variables to your user persona, so demographic, behavioral elements, and creating this will help create personas that are relevant to the problem that you're trying to solve. You then have to test and validate them. So by conducting user interviews constantly, you can refine your persona. You want to use them as a guide, and keep in mind that your user persona can evolve with your project as goals change. So moving into user stories are also a part of an agile approach that helps shift the focus from writing about requirements to actually talking about them. So user stories are short, simple descriptions of a feature told from the perspective of a user. They typically follow this template. So as a type of user, I want to do a certain, I have a certain goal so that I can achieve a certain goal. So what is a user story? You want it to be concise and quickly understood. You want it to tell the story of the problem or needs that the user has to solve through using your website or app. And it can be a living story that is constantly updated. It should also provide sufficient action-oriented information so that developers and designers can work to understand the functional need of the user. So moving on to the second principle, it's prioritizing your goals. So once you've learned your user personas through, you should be able to answer the key question: what will my users expect from this dashboard? A great rule of thumb for data disclosure in dashboards is that you should always start with a high-level overview and provide easy paths for your users to increase the level of granularity. The bottom line is dashboards must always save the user time. Always design your dashboard so that it can help your user be more efficient. You only want to show relevant information. You want to simplify what you show and how you show it. So an example is when you're faced with a text-heavy document, how many times do you actually read it to understand the meaning? If you're like most people, you may end up skimming the content or not reading it at all. The same holds true for analytics dashboards. So if you include too much content or present content in an overly complex design, your end user might not even bother using your analytics at all. So you always want to remember that less is more. And once you have prioritized those goals and thought about the key takeaways, you can think about the 5 key takeaways that your users want to see in your dashboard, and then apply the F and Z reading pattern when structuring your dashboard. So the F and Z patterns create visual hierarchy in designs. Basically, it's as the letters suggest. So the F pattern is when users first read in a horizontal movement, usually across the upper part of the content area, which forms the initial top of the F. Then next, users move down the page a little bit and then scan horizontally again, but typically this time it's a little bit shorter than the first time, and this is the F's lower bar. Finally, users scan the content on the left side in a vertical movement, and this is the F stem. So this is a pattern that you want to go for when you're designing dashboards. Also, there's the Z pattern, which is better to use when simplicity is a priority and you have a main call to action takeaway. So How do we present the right content in the right way? This takes me to my third principle, which is making sure you're telling a clear story. So as I mentioned, you want to make the complex simple. When you design your dashboard, you want to consider the principles of information architecture and hierarchy when you decide which cards to show and in which positions. So using information architecture will help you limit the amount of content and data you're presenting. You can organize your content and to support usability and findability. So you want to lead with the absolute top must-have takeaways and let your dashboard flow from there. All the elements are of course important, but some cards are more important than others. So you want to limit the amount of content and data you're presenting, and this is one of the foundations of a visually effective dashboard. So there are ways that you can lay out your content in an easily understandable format, and layouts are basically where user interface design starts to kick in. You want to lay out your dashboard in a way that you are showing the most important things front and center to the user. So you want to start with a wireframe. Make sure you're sketching out your wireframes. You once you start digitizing that, you want to use a grid, and you want to embrace white space. White space are the empty spaces around every piece of content on a page, and it is an essential element of good design. The perfect amount of white space makes a design feel balanced and pleasing, while a lack of white space makes a design feel cramped and unfinished. So moving on to the next point, it's to visualize your data correctly. So you want to be using the right charts. If you are reporting on key performance indicators, a big number chart can sometimes be used, which is just a single number in large bold text, and it can be used to draw attention to metrics that are particularly important. If you're doing comparisons, line charts are the best to use when you want to show the trend over a period of time with continuous data. It allows you to compare the performance of a single metric from week to week, month to month, or year to year, and it also allows you to look at multiple metrics at once. Line charts are the most effective and flexible chart for displaying any sort of continuous time series data. Moving on to compositions, the most common way of visualizing simple compositions is with a pie chart or a donut chart. However, keep in mind that we're not usually very good at reading pie charts accurately, so you have to use them with caution. They're good for showing compositions of 2 segments up to 5 segments, as long as the size of each segment is very different. So just make sure that you're explicitly labeling each segment as well. And relationships, the last type is 2 key types of relationships you might want to reveal in a visualization are correlations and distributions. So a scatter plot is the standard treatment to look at the correlation and distribution of 2 continuous variables. Just remember that if you do have a correlation, whether it's positive or negative, it's always good to point out a trend to help your audience out. So data visualizations don't have to be fancy. In fact, simpler is usually better. And I'll keep repeating this throughout this webinar. So using simple charts like line charts, bar charts, bubble charts, you won't run the risk of confusing your user, and they won't have to work to interpret your charts. So presenting data like this will help the user see what's important in an instant, doing what a dashboard should always do, which is save the user time. You also want to keep it simple, so only include the most relevant information, at least in your initial screen. And where suitable, allow users to drill down into more complex data and options if they want to. You also want to group related or relevant data. When you have data sets that are easier to understand when seen together, find ways of presenting them in a single card. And always be careful not to confuse the user. So moving on from charts and onto colors, we always want to use a single highlight color. So as shown in this report design, color is a powerful tool for highlighting significant data points and drawing attention. Just make sure that you're using highlight colors with restraint. Many bright contrasting colors will compete with each other and will overwhelm the senses, distracting from the message that you're trying to communicate. So sticking with a single highlight color will enhance your user's comprehension and will even help tie your dashboard together. So here is an example of a Venngage email newsletter template aimed at sharing monthly revenue results with employees. I've made the first example black and white to remove any visual salience gained from color information. When I first glance at this, I immediately see the banner image at the top and the highlighted chunk of the pie chart at the bottom because they're particularly dark. But the most important information here, which is the revenue, customer base, and market share, doesn't stand out. So realistically, you want to keep in mind that we only have a few seconds to catch our user's attention. Using color to highlight the key bits of information, we can capture our reader's attention in a fraction of that time. And with a single color strategically creating some visual salience, we've dramatically improved our chances of engaging with our users. So the next point is to use consistent design language. So consistent design is intuitive design. In short, usability and learnability improve when similar elements have consistent look and function in a similar way. When consistency is present in your design, people can transfer knowledge to new context and learn things quickly without any pain. So this way, the user can focus on carrying out the task at hand and not learning how the product UI works every time they switch context. So there are some benefits to consistency. Users will learn faster how to use your designs. So you want to imagine that consistent elements in your design are like letters in the alphabet. So once the user has learned the alphabet, they can go anywhere in your product and still be able to communicate with the interface without any friction. However, having inconsistent interface is like trying to communicate with the user in several languages. So only the advanced users might be able to finish their tasks. So you want to keep it simple and consistent. Consistency eliminates confusion. So when the user starts to feel confused, the next step for them is to start feeling frustration, which is something we really want to avoid. And consistency also saves money and time. So consistent design is frequently built by predefined components. So this allows designers and stakeholders to make decisions quickly without spending time on creating new design elements. So saving time can help you build the product and make incremental improvements. And as I have on the slide here, there are 4 types of consistency that you want to look out for when you're designing. The first one is visual consistency. So this increases learnability of your product. This includes fonts, sizes, buttons, labelings. Basically, all of these elements need to be consistent across the product to keep a visual consistency. The next is functional. So similar controls that are functioning the same way make up functional consistency. This increases the predictability of your product, which leads to users feeling safe and secure. An example of this is if a way to go a step back into the flow should function the same way across the product in different areas. The third one is internal consistency. So this improves usability and learnability of the product, and it is a combination of a visual and functional consistency in your product design. So even when you introduce new features and pages, users will have an easy way using them as long as you are keeping the product internally consistent. And the last one is external consistency. So this type is achieved where there is design consistency across multiple systems and products. This way, the user's knowledge for one product can be used in another. An example of external consistency can be Apple products, so your iPhone, then your iPad, then your Mac. Another example can be the interface of Adobe products. So once you know how Adobe Photoshop works, then it's so much easier to get used to how Adobe Illustrator works and Adobe After Effects works. So all those products have external consistency among them. And achieving these 4 types of consistency will help your design gain better usability and ultimately leading to happier users. So how to be consistent, I mentioned some of this. So the first one is within your visuals. So you want to have a style guide. You want to use the same typography, colors, spaces, grid, sizes, positions. These elements need to be defined in one central place and then used across the system you're designing. You want to define strong visual hierarchy and having the most important things bigger than the less important ones. And you want to use the same color palette across your product. Another thing is padding and margins need to be consistent in all similar elements. So buttons, cards, everything should be ordered in a grid of your choice. So this goes back to when you're creating those wireframes and you're using a grid. So having consistent visuals will allow the user to learn the system quickly and allow them to have a smooth experience. The next is voice and tone. So the language and tone you use throughout the user flow influences how your user perceives your product. You want to keep the voice and tone consistent so it feels as though one voice is speaking to the user throughout their whole product experience. If you want to keep it funny and friendly, then you want to keep that all the way through up until the error and fail messages. An example of a company that does this really well is MailChimp, so you can check that out after. And also you want to use familiar patterns. So people who are using your dashboard and your design, whether it be digital or not, have been around for some time. This means that they have experience and learned other designs and know the patterns used in them. So you want to take advantage of this and use familiar patterns that people are used to. Moving on to text hierarchy. You always want to have 3 levels of text hierarchy applied to your entire dashboard. So at the very least, you want to have different styles and sizes for your header text, subheader text, and body text. Obviously, headers should be bigger and bold enough to grab your user's attention, a bit stylized. Subheaders should be a little smaller and a little less stylized, and body text should be more minimal in style and highly readable. You can also create visual hierarchy by varying your size and weight, because this will add emphasis to some text and de-emphasize others. So as you can see in the difference between these two, some have been bolded, italicized, so that is adding weight to your font. And the sizes obviously differ as well. So while size alone can be enough to create a visual hierarchy within your text, weight can add emphasis and add a little extra oomph. As you can see here, you varying the size and font of a single varying the size and weight of a single font creates visual hierarchy. The next thing to keep in mind with typography is font pairing. So fonts play a huge role in how information is perceived. You can argue that as long as text is readable, the font choice doesn't matter, but fonts actually play a huge role in visual communication. So we have 2 types of classifications. We have serif fonts and sans serif fonts. So serif fonts are the slight projections and strokes at the end of letters. And sans means without in French, hence sans serif fonts lack these projections on their letters. They are also considered to be more modern. So simply put, you want to choose fonts that complement each other, and a safe approach is to mix serif and sans serif fonts. They tend to work really well together, particularly at contrasting sizes. The next thing I'm going to talk about is readability of your font. So an easy way to gauge whether a font may cause you problems down the road is to carry out this IL1 test. So you want to type out a capital I, a lowercase l, and the number 1. If there is little to no distinction between the 3, this could cause readability issues down the road. So it is a good place to start when you are picking your body font. Principle number 8 is to get inspired. You want to look for inspiration elsewhere. You want to create a mood board. Collect examples to get your creative juices flowing. And you can refer back to this during the design process and discuss these visual ideas with your stakeholders. So some ideas for places to look at, you can look at Pinterest, you can look at Musely by Envision. They are constantly post inspirational design on there. You can also check out Dribbble, which is a platform that a lot of designers go to for inspiration. Principle number 9 is to have a responsive dashboard design. So adding a responsive design to the dashboard will allow the user to decide which data they want to focus on. The key to a good responsive design is a clear, easily understood UI, which allows the user to control exactly which data needs to be front and center in the dashboard. For example, an example of this is you can add a slider interface, which allows the user to focus on the main data window or the drill down data in the sidebar, and having them change the level of detail that they get in each of the charts. Again, for getting some inspiration on responsive design, you can check out Pinterest, Musical.ly, and Dribbble. There's a lot of examples on there. And the last point is to test and iterate. So you want to make sure that, so you start off the design process by building your personas, your user stories, doing your user interviews. Then you want to define and prioritize your needs, IDA, create your user flows, your sketches, your wireframes. Then you want to create those prototypes that are going to get tested. And this end to steps need to constantly be repeated. So you want to test your product, do usability tests, and then iterate on those tests, and then validate it. And you keep running more tests and validating your designs. So this is basically the entire design process. You want to consistently be running user interviews, doing user tests, and validating your designs. You want to make sure that throughout the entire design process, you're keeping your user personas in mind. And with that, that is all the 10 principles. So on here, I have a little summary of what I've talked about. So know your audience, create user personas, create user stories. You want to prioritize your goals based on the persona that you created. You want to tell a clear story, so make sure the most important things are front and center, and the least important things are can be found through more investigation. You want to visualize your data correctly, so using the correct charts. You want to use a single highlight color to emphasize information in your dashboard, using consistent design language for allowing the user to learn how to use your product easily. Keep in mind typography, so text hierarchy, font pairing, and running the IL1 test for legibility of your body font. You want to get inspired and create mood boards, look at inspiration websites. You want to make sure that your dashboard is responsive, and in the end, you have to make sure that you're testing and iterating on the design. So the design process is not a linear process, it's a cyclic process. You consistently want to test and iterate. So with that, I want to thank you all for tuning in. The slides will be provided to you, and if you have any questions, you can ask me right now, or you can ask me and connect with me via Twitter, LinkedIn, or send me an email, mana@Venngage. Yeah, thank you so much for listening.
Great, thank you so much, Mana. We do have a few questions that have come in. And audience, if you do have any more questions, please post them into the questions panel. The first question today is, are there common mistakes you see people make when they design dashboards or reports for the applications? How do you avoid this from the start?
I would say a common mistake is trying to solve for all the problems and trying to fit too much into your dashboard. So having overcomplicated charts, not leaving white space, and trying to put a ton of information in your dashboard. So you can avoid this by building out your user persona and trying to think about the 5 key takeaways that your user wants to see. So it's really important to keep your user in mind and not design for how you think the dashboard should be designed. And by doing that, you can avoid overcomplicating the dashboard.
Awesome. The next question that we have is, how do you know if your dashboard is useful or usable?
Yeah, so this again goes into part of the design process of making sure you're doing usability tests and user interviews. So when you run usability interviews in the beginning of the process, you gather your information, you build out your personas, and then when you are actually designing the process, you want to run usability tests right away. So when you have a prototype and it's not actually built, so engineers have not actually put time into building it, you want to validate that prototype is what they should be spending time on. So there's a lot of places where you can run usability tests. One thing that we use at Venngage sometimes is usertesting.com. So you can basically post your prototype on there, and people go and you ask them questions that you want them to answer while they're going through your product or prototype, and you can see where they are confused, what doesn't really make sense to them, and you can take that, iterate on it. You want to do this a few times before you even get to the final design that you want your developer to create, sorry. And once the dashboard is being created, you also want to be iterative in how you release it. So you want to follow the agile process of trying to break it down so that little by little you can release aspects to users and validate them before you put all of your energy into creating this ideal dashboard that you've created. So just making sure that you are constantly testing your prototypes and your ideas with users and to tying that back into the product. So iterating on the product once you get that feedback.
Great. The next question that we have is, do you have any tips for working and designing with multiple user groups using the same application?
Yeah, so when you are creating user personas, you don't necessarily need to have one user persona. Sometimes you will even have two primary personas, but you don't usually want to have more than two primary personas. And you can have other types of personas, so secondary personas that meet most of the goals of your product, but have a few other goals in mind, or tertiary personas. So you just want to make sure you're prioritizing your personas and you're solving for the problem that is targeted towards your primary personas. One thing you want to avoid is trying to solve for edge cases that some people might come across. You want to try to solve for the main user flow and use case initially, and then you want to try to think about those edge cases to solve for. But it's really good to have multiple personas and to always bring them back in when you're designing. So just always thinking about what are their goals, what are their frustrations, their pain points, their motivations, why are they coming into your tool? So that's really important. What are they hoping to get out of the tool? So yeah, just keeping the personas in mind while you're designing, and making sure that you're designing for the main use case before trying to solve for the edge cases.
Awesome. We do have a couple more questions. And again, audience, if you do have any questions, please post them into the questions panel. The next question is, for someone just getting started with little design experience, which principle do you recommend as the first step?
So I think the most important principle is being able to get out of your own head and your own mental models, and understanding that you're not designing this for yourself, you're designing it for other people. So this goes back to making sure you're doing user interviews. Before anybody creates anything, you have to go interview a ton of people, talk to a lot of people, get a lot of information from the outside world before you even start your idea of how you're designing, and before you even create your personas. So just being aware of different mental models, and making sure that you're always putting yourself in the user's shoes. So we have this term at Venngage that we use a lot, which is eat your own dog food. So what we do all the time is every week we have a challenge and people have to go into the tool and create designs using our tool so that we are experiencing issues that our users are having when they're using our tool and not just being on the outside. So yeah, you always have to eat your own dog food. So making sure you're putting yourself in your user's shoes and making sure that you're designing for your users, not yourself.
Awesome, thank you. And the last question that we do have currently is, can you speak to any principles to remember for drilling down?
I think principles to really drill down is to make sure that you're only displaying the most important information in your dashboard. You don't want to overcomplicate the dashboard. Don't use confusing and complicated charts. You want the user to quick, like at a glance, look at the dashboard and get what you're trying to convey to them. However, having a responsive dashboard is really important. If people are more interested to know and get into more complicated charts and get to know more information, there should be a way for them to drill down and get that information. However, at a first glance, a dashboard should be very easy and quick to understand and very simple. So a lot of the principles I talked about kind of go into this. So making sure you're using the right charts, making sure you're having enough white space and you have a grid and you use a wireframe, and all of that goes into making sure that um, your users can look at your dashboard and have a quick takeaway of what you're trying to tell them.
Great. And that was the last question that we had. So Mana, is there anything you would like to add before we close things out?
I would just like to thank everybody for tuning in, and thank you guys for having me speak about dashboard design. And if anybody has any more questions, they can feel free to email me. My email is just mana@venngage.com, and I'll make sure to get back to them.
Great. First off, Mana, I want to thank you for a great webinar presentation today. And I would also like to thank today's sponsor, Logi Analytics, for providing the audience with the great webinar presentation. And lastly, thank you to everyone who attended today. We hope you learned something new that will help you further your career. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.